Welcome to ByteWise, the podcast where technology meets risk management. And now, introducing the hosts, Daniela Parker, with a background in risk management and a passion for making risk-aware decisions. Next, Glenn Sorensen, a veteran in cybersecurity and supporting while protecting. And last but not least, Brian Talon, the technology whiz who's a master of collaboration. Ever wondered how blockchain's potential weighs against its pitfalls? Or how AI's advancements align with ethical considerations? Whether listeners are tech aficionados looking to view challenges through a risk lens or risk professionals seeking clarity in the digital maze, ByteWise has them covered. Dive in as the trio decodes, discusses, and demystifies the intertwined realms of technology and risk. Tune into ByteWise, where technology and risk converge with clarity and insight.
Hi, and welcome to episode 2 of ByteWise, where we unravel the confusion between tech and risk management. So the three of us are back again to help connect some of the dots for all of you in the technology and risk management fields. Again, with me are Brian and Glenn. Hi, Brian and Glenn.
Hello.
Hi, Daniela.
Last week, for our first episode, we talked a little bit about the experiences that we had working together and the reasons why we started the podcast. And as promised last time, today we're going to start talking about some of the concepts that we have encountered in our professional environments where we think there's confusion we can help clear up and also provide some actionable facts for people to go back to their organizations and say, okay, now I understand what's what and how do we use this and what does that mean? So today we're going to talk about all of the assessments and the audits. There's lots of assessments that happen in the risk and technology field, and then we also deal with audits, right? So let's start out by talking about some basic concepts. One of the questions that I get a lot working in the risk management field is about the difference between audit and risk management, and then the difference between an actual audit and a risk assessment. And for me, the easiest way to look at the difference between audit and risk management has always been about audit being a backwards looking discipline. So they go back and they check control effectiveness, and risk management really being a forward-looking discipline, right? Like we're trying to see where are the risks. We look at impact, likelihood, and mitigation, and we're forward-looking. The mitigation part is where the overlap is for me, where audit assesses how effective the mitigation is, because I don't do that when I do a risk assessment. And so that to me is kind of the big difference there. And in an audit, again, they look at control effectiveness. When I look at a risk assessment, I really look at what are the risks that are tied to a process, to a product, and then I go through the impact, likelihood, and mitigation. So in its simplest form, for me, that's always been the best way to explain it. Love to hear from the two of you on that one.
Yeah, I have some thoughts there. The other thing that comes to mind about audit is you have to have something to audit against, a standard, a framework, something that's a little bit more concrete. And that's some of the areas where audit can kind of not dive, I guess, but drift maybe is the right word into other areas that are squishier and more about practices, and it drifts into the realm of something beyond an audit.
Like opinions?
Like opinions. Like opinions. So,
best practices is a favorite, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's, what's best practices for one organization may be very different than for another organization or the industry at large. So I think that's rather squishy in my mind.
So I guess I'll play devil's advocate coming from the risk side. Couldn't you say the same thing about a risk assessment? Brian, what do you think?
I guess you could, but with a risk assessment, we're looking at more quantifiable risks, even down to the dollar amount that's at stake. And I think back to best practices, if I can comment on that just a bit. The great thing about standards and best practices is everyone has one. and everyone has their own. So, you know, just one auditor's best practice is another auditor's, joke, right? And I know, even Glenn and I, we talk about different best practices and different criteria for how we assess the danger that is presented by external security forces, if you will, or bad actors. So in in my mind, the difference really is the quantifiable risk that gives me what I need to to know to go forward and take some action.
Yeah, and I know I always tried to have like a quantitative risk assessment, right? Looking at the impact from a dollar perspective. That's not always easy because there's some areas where it's very much like you have to build some assumptions out. But in general, I believe that you can pretty much quantify anything. And from my perspective, and I think that goes for all areas, when you put a dollar sign in front of a decision maker, that has a much better you have a much better likelihood of being successful with what you're asking for, right? And I think that is one of the values that a risk assessment brings to the table, to say, so here's the risk. We're not mitigated to where we need to be mitigated to, but the impact is much higher than what it would cost us to actually fix this. So I've always been a fan of the quantitative risk assessments versus the high, medium, low, because then we get back into the, okay, so what's high for me is probably not high for other people, right? And so any other thoughts on just that as a starting point, audits versus risk assessments?
Yeah, on that topic a little bit, the dollar signs make a much better case, and it's also easier to prioritize often, rather than something that's just high, medium, and low, because maybe you've got 4 highs and 5 mediums and 13 lows, but like, what does that really mean? And what is what is the risk associated with that? One high might be really high and one might be, kind of low high. So there's more subjectivity, I would say, and it makes prioritization a little bit harder.
So it has to pass the so what test, right? The whole
Yeah.
like, so what? Like,
So what? Indeed.
right.
So what? Indeed.
um, so the chicken and the egg question is, what do you do first? Do you do a risk assessment first, or do you start with an audit? Also keeping in mind that the audit discipline also uses risk assessments. Like they do an enterprise-wide risk assessment usually on an annual basis. Ideally, that happens in collaboration with the risk management space, but that's not necessarily where everyone's at, right? Like not every organization has it set up that way, but they do their own risk assessment. Then the risk management function does a risk assessment. But what should come first, an audit or a risk assessment? Brian, what do you think?
I don't. I don't really have an opinion on which should come first. I've generally seen audit come first, and for me, it's more useful that way. Frankly, audit's great at pointing out, all the things that are missing, all the things that are being done, how they feel are incorrect. But back to your so what, I've seen plenty of audit reports that have given me a giant list of things that the auditor believes we should be doing differently. And when you actually quantify it, it gets down to, like you said, so what, right? Here's something they believe we should be doing differently, and the chances of it actually happening are so slim that we wouldn't want to spend any resources trying to fix it, since resources are not unlimited. So for me, that audit is great to point out all the things, but then the assessment's actually where I'm going to spend my time and where I'm going to prioritize from.
Yeah, and that's a good point, right? Like there is a lot of value in an audit. I don't ever want to downplay that.
For sure.
It's just how it's being used, right? And then back to also the question is, if there's an audit finding, that doesn't just mean that we look at the audit finding and address the audit finding, but sometimes we have audit findings that force us to go back look at our own policies and procedures and say, is this actually how we want to do it? Because you have to audit to something. So you audit the policies and procedures and possibly a framework. which ideally the framework is captured in a policy somewhere. But again, we're talking, ideal. Um, Glenn, thoughts on that? What comes first, risk assessment or audit?
Yeah, I'd say the thing that comes to mind for me is that an audit requires that something has already been put in place or in practice. And I've worked with some organizations that are about as new startup as you can get. So they don't have anything to audit to yet. So in those cases, I think the assessment is the place to start. And I think you can start in either place. It depends on what you want to assess against or audit against, and what your goals are.
So when you're describing a startup, right? Like, so I've always worked in a regulated industry, and for us, it's pretty much like there's just no discussion about it. You're going to have your audits done. How do you I mean, how do you address that though? When your audit committee or your board says you need to have an audit done and you kind of already know where the issues are, what you really need is that assessment piece because that's like we said, that helps you prioritize, right? Like you already know the issues. I just need an assessment now to help me create that roadmap. Thoughts on that? Because I know that's a big struggle because we audit quite a lot. And I've seen it, especially in the IT space, where it just keeps piling on and on and on.
I would say the other thing about that is you need to get back to the question of what do we really want out of this? And I think you got it, part of it there, but I think management needs some help in understanding the difference between those sometimes as well. The assessment is what I want for prioritization of things going forward. That's what I want to build the roadmap off of. The problem I run into with audits sometimes is there's just the list of items with some vague risk level or prioritization attached. But in some cases, there may be 5 audit findings that are related to one thing. And that one thing, if you fix the source of that problem, those other 5 items then go away or are remediated. And I think that's where the assessment can come in and look at that and say, here's the source of some of these other problems. Let's address that. And then you can start assigning values to level of effort, resources, and use that to help prioritize and build your roadmap too.
I feel like we could probably do one episode on just how to approach that subject with the people who make the decisions on, your audits and your assessments, people who approve your budget. Like, how do you actually approach that? Because that can be tricky. I know that from experience. So just on a side note, I think we should talk about that sometime.
I like
So
that.
it's not just audits and risk assessments, though, that we deal with. There are, on the IT side in particular, on the InfoSec side, we have the pen tests and vulnerability assessments. I have to admit, I am not going to talk much about that. I'm going to turn it over to the two of you to kind of walk through a pen test versus a vulnerability assessment. And then there was a third one. What was the third one?
Vulnerability scanning is
There
often
you go.
used
So
with
those
some of
three.
those things. So
Yeah. So Glenn, do you want to kick us off?
yeah. So a penetration test or pen test is manual technical testing. And I want to say manual because there's a person behind it with hands on keyboard. They may be running tools that do automated things. They may be running vulnerability scanners, but ultimately they are looking for vulnerabilities. And the key distinction here between that and a vulnerability assessment is in a pen test, they're looking to validate those suspected vulnerabilities. They're looking to exploit them. They're looking to get further. They're looking to actually get at sensitive data and the paths at which they can do that. So I would say there's some breadth there, but there's more depth there. The vulnerability assessment is more of a broad look, looking for vulnerabilities or things that we think might be vulnerabilities. And again, this is a human being behind a keyboard, maybe running tools, but there's a human. And they're looking to find things that are the low-hanging fruit, the things that are more easily visible to a would-be attacker, maybe working their way in through a couple of different layers. And we could talk on a whole other podcast episode about that too. But looking for the things that can help an organization fix the low-hanging fruit that they see. The third thing then is a vulnerability scan, and that is really more taking a tool like Nessus or Qualys and scanning the network. It's, maybe a person is pushing the button, but it's really the tool doing the thing. And there's often less human involved and human judgment involved. So a lot of those tools then they're useful, but only after you put them through the lens of a human that knows what they're looking for, that can put it in context. Some of the I guess risk ratings or criticality ratings you get from the tools are not necessarily that in every environment. So they can be kind of dumb that way.
So I actually have a couple of questions on this. So you said there's like a human that then reviews them, and that's always for me that's always a big question, right? So I'm on the risk management side of the house, and the pen tests and the vulnerability assessments to me are really hard to understand because there's a lot of technical detail in those assessments that I don't necessarily all understand. But the question is, say if you're in an organization where IT and InfoSec are one and the same, right?
Mhm.
How do you create a little bit of independence when it comes to reviewing this stuff? Is that just because it's done by a third party that we rely on it, or do we follow up in house with it? I've always struggled with that piece. And then who actually does it? Is that audit? Is that risk management? Who like what is the best way, or is that not even necessary, I guess?
I think if you have the human involved, maybe on the InfoSec side, as long as they are allowed to be independent and point out things in IT systems or even in business practices, the pen test and vulnerability assessment work, you can find a lot of things that are, if you did this a different way, this wouldn't be a vulnerability. So I don't want to discount that either. But usually it's pointing out something in IT, and there can be some butting of heads, I think, in terms of what security, what InfoSec thinks is important versus what IT can think is important or not in some of those contexts.
Brian, you're the IT side here. You have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm in one of those scenarios that you talked about there, where IT and InfoSec are in the same organization. The way that we currently manage that, we've been in organizations that deal with it both ways. But the way that we currently manage that is we do all of our vulnerability, and that vulnerability assessments, the pen tests, they're all available to our leadership, our steering committees, and so there's really nothing to hide. Nothing gets buried within IT, because I think that's really where part of the concern about independence is something's going to get buried or something's going to get lost. So as long
Mhm.
as we make that transparent enough, I don't think it's as big a deal. Obviously, if I was in a larger organization, we would have those as two separate entities. But in a lot of smaller organizations, there's just not enough staff to do that. Uh, so essentially, when these tests are done, when vulnerabilities or pen tests or whatnot, then then it's about business decisions. Really, I think that's something that gets lost a lot on both technology people and business people. As a matter of fact, is all of this is really a business decision. Uh, Pen tests can find things, vulnerability assessments, the tools they can find things. Then we need to make a business decision whether we're going to spend the time, effort, and money to fix those. And that's where the human comes in that Glenn is referring to.
I have a question on that one though, because
Sure.
what I've seen, you're like, sure, she has a question. What I've seen is that and we talked about this last time, when the IT stuff, when the technology things come up, the non-technology folks are kind of a lot of times afraid to ask questions, to really dig in, And what I found on the other side is that, that like we're just going to start talking tech and run circles around you so you stop asking us questions. I've
Right.
seen this a lot. And like while I agree that if everybody has access to it, then that ensures transparency. I'm like, well, but do they actually know what the heck they're looking at? Because I've just looked at one recently and I'm like, well, that sounds really bad to me, but I don't know. I'm not sure, again, I'm not the one that has to make that can make that call. And that's my struggle. And to your point, the reason why that call for independence is there is because if you're in charge of technology and you're supposed to get stuff done, security can often slow you down. Fair statement?
Absolutely.
And so like for me, it's like, are we missing out? Are we missing things because of that weird setup almost?
Yeah,
Uh,
so some thoughts there too. And I think, both technology and InfoSec folks need to get better about communicating in common terms, in business language, and being more understandable. I think that is definitely a thing. I think there's a push for it too, which is good. But I think the flip side of that too is there also has to be a step taken from the business side to understand what some of that technology means. So I think most of that is on us as IT and InfoSec professionals to be better at communicating. But I think there's also a little bit of a step from the business side too that's generally needed in my experience.
and I'll add to that if I can.
Yeah.
I think really, and this is maybe moving off topic just a little bit, but this is really where the challenge to the business is to make sure you're choosing the right IT leadership. Uh, the best technology people in the world may not be very good at translating something into something, something into language that others can understand. And if they can't do that, they really don't belong in that leadership position and making those decisions. And if they're annoyed by the fact that you're asking those questions, again, that's probably not the field for them.
And like I think it's gonna be really hard for us to move off topic because everything we talk about is so connected. I find that every time we talk about it, I'm like, well, this plays into this, and then it's all somehow connected, right? And on that same note, I remember when we were looking for to hire someone for the InfoSec side, and I mean, it was part of risk management, and so a lot of the people we interviewed were either IT auditors or they were IT folks, right?
Yes.
And we needed that risk management piece where people know how to ask the right questions and then know how to express something into a risk statement and guide better decision making rather than saying, nope, can't do that, right? Like that's tough. It's a tough skill set to find. We
Definitely.
had a heck of a time, right, Glenn?
Yeah, indeed.
And
And
it's the same for what you're saying, Brian, like having the ability to translate that for someone like me. Good luck.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
the ability to communicate though is it's critical, and it's one of those soft skills that everybody lists on a job posting. You need to have this, but like, what does that really mean, and who can do it? And that's actually maybe more important than would be evidenced by a single line item on a job description. So
Yeah, very true. So back to these assessments. So how often, and I looked, right? We talked about this before the call. A couple of us work in regulated industries. So trying to find out like what the requirement actually is. And, for us in financial services, I was looking at the FFIC guidance and it's very vague. It's just, it basically kind of goes back to depends on complexity and size of the organization. But from your perspective, right? Number one, what comes first? Like, where do we start? We already talked about the audit and the risk assessment. And I don't think that, I mean, both the audit and the risk assessment pull information from those three tools, I would think. Um, but how do you line them up? Like, do you run them at the same time? Is that how it's intended to be? How often do we do those?
Well, there's a big it depends there.
Yep.
Always.
Um, and I look back and I try and put myself in the shoes of the folks that were writing that guidance to begin with. And I think they intended to leave it open because there was some understanding there of risk, I think. And, what is needed for a particular organization may be different than the next organization. But what you have is a lot of auditors and examiners that have built some interpretation on top of that, and that has kind of developed into some established patterns. And I think in the credit union space in particular, there's this like expectation of annual penetration test. And when you actually look at the guidance, it doesn't say you need an annual penetration test done by a third party. It's much squishier than that. What is the penetration test, quote unquote requirement has kind of grown out of an interpretation of that. What is really needed there is an assessment to determine what your vulnerabilities are and what you might do about them. It comes down to managing risk, really.
Always. It's all we do is manage risk.
Yep. So.
And then there is no expectation in regards to, or at least not that I have seen, like, so it's one thing when you do the test, right? But then how are you managing what you get out of the test? And then where does that decision get made? Back to what Brian said, right? Like once you present that, it turns into a business decision or a risk decision. Where is the impact? How do we balance the risk and reward out? But there's nothing in there about that. It's just like you do it. And sometimes, actually, probably a lot of times, that's what it is. It's a checkbox exercise. Yes. Would you say those assessments, I mean, I think they bring value. That's me from the non-tech side. What about the two of you? What do you think about those?
I think they bring value. Again, a lot of times finding these things that are open, these porous protocols or whatever that shouldn't be open, those type of things. That's not something that a lot of people in IT particularly have time for, where they're trying to do their daily support and their keep the lights on stuff and projects and everything like that. And going and seeking those out is not something that is always top of mind. So I think it's very valuable to find out information like that, because it's generally, or very often, a lot of those things can be fixed within minutes. It's just finding them. And so I think there's a lot of value in that.
I would add to that a little bit. I've seen such a crapshoot of the quality of penetration test reports and vulnerability assessment reports. And, one approach that I've seen that I particularly hate is, here's, one port that we don't think needs to be open, so that's a finding. And here's another port on the same server that may be open, and we don't think that needs to be open, so that's a finding. And so you get a laundry list of this stuff that is, 4,000 findings. And, well, is that actually 4,000 findings, or is it one finding? And that's like, you need to have a better control over hardening and what is, how you build out a server or service and what it really needs. So
that's a great point, Glenn. I actually have recently received something similar from a pen test, and the direction was review all the open ports. Well, I mean, Windows Server has 65,000 open, or 65,000 ports. If you have any sizable server farm out there, times that by 65,000, and that's what review all the ports is going to get you, is essentially a full-time job forever.
Full-time job forever. Yeah, I like that.
That's pretty much what it boils down to.
There's a lot of tooling that can help, go through that and, automate that. But at the end of the day, like, if a port is open and there's something sitting at the other end, there may be a reason, there may not be a reason. Maybe it was just something that was misconfigured, or something legacy that, this port was open from 10,000 years ago when we were doing, X, Y, or Z. And it just persists. But the other part of that may be, well, there's something sitting behind it, but I don't know what that is. And I'm not sure if it's critical or not. I'm not sure if it's important and if shutting it down will break something in the environment. So like review all ports is, not a good answer to that. But maybe the way that penetration testers might approach that in the future is, hey, we see this one particular port open. It's not clear what this thing is. You should review this one port on this one server because, X, Y, or Z. We think it may be a risk, and turn it off if it is and it's not needed. So,
well, we're kind of at time. I guess my one tip after listening to this, right? It's a lot. We could probably talk about this for quite some time, but I think what I would encourage my fellow risk professionals to do is reach out to the technology folks in your organization and ask them, like sit down with them and have them walk you through the last pen test, right? Like ask the questions, because I know that even though I may not fully understand the explanation, the more often I hear it, the more it sinks in. But that's really the thing where I think these assessments they should not live in a silo, just like everything else, right? But they should not live in a silo. They should bring value to the organization as a whole. Any other takeaways, tips from the two of you?
Back to communication, I think, again, for me. And that's, the pen test report is a form of communication. Like you have to communicate that in a way that can be understood. I think there's room for executive summaries and high level risk, explanations of the risk or vulnerabilities and why things are important to fix. And then there's the technical detail you can include in the report for the technical folks, but it needs to communicate to both. So.
Brian?
And so I guess my final thought on this is that anyone who's been through a security incident of any, major sort, anybody who's been through that is glad to have somebody or some company or some tool to point these things out. Again, if you've been through it, you never want to go through it again.
Okay. All right. Well, I think next time we're going to talk about what I mentioned. How do you present these to the decision makers, right? How do you get budget money? I mean, again, if they're required, that's one thing, but what if you want a couple of extra ones? Let's talk about that next time, like how you present some of the value, and then maybe engaging a firm that's more expensive. I don't know. We have a lot of scenarios that I know I've dealt with. So let's talk a little bit about how to approach the decision makers that aren't the risk or technology professionals with some of these items and then get support in the organization. All right. So we will be back next month. And thanks for listening.
Thank you for joining us on ByteWise today. As we wrap up, we're reminded of the ever-evolving world of technology and its intricate dance with risk. Whether you're diving deep into code or dissecting risk scenarios, remember to always bridge understanding with insight. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep tuning into ByteWise.